Hello and welcome to Noble Mind.
Noble Mind is a podcast exploring mindfulness, meditation, and psychology. Hello, listeners. Thank you for tuning in today. In this episode, we had the honor of talking to Dr. Janina Fisher about her groundbreaking work on healing trauma. We discuss her new workbook, Transforming the Living Legacy of Trauma, explore what it means to be triggered and how to work with it, and discuss the importance of paying attention to the body as a central part of the healing process.
Janina Fisher is an international expert on the treatment of trauma and dissociation, assistant director of the Sensorimotor Psychotherapy Institute, and author of Healing the Fragmented Selves of Trauma Survivors and Transforming the Living Legacy of Trauma. As always, you can learn more about Dr. Fisher, get this episode's show notes, and join our email list by visiting noblemindpodcast.com. We hope you enjoy the show.
Today, we are honored to have with us Dr. Janina Fisher. Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much.
Would you start out by telling our listeners a little bit about yourself and your background?
I am a clinical psychologist who discovered trauma when I think everyone else in the world was discovering trauma in the early 90s. Really up until then, we had no idea that trauma was such a common experience of human beings. We didn't know that child abuse was rampant. We were just beginning to understand domestic violence. We were actually just beginning to understand the effects of sexual assault on women. So we were in the dark ages, and I was lucky enough to discover this very wonderful, always challenging field just as it was starting. So I felt like I had a front row seat to the development of the field, and had the wonderful good fortune to study with what were then the pioneers in the field, Judith Herman and Bessel van der Kolk, both from Boston, of course. And so there we were in it. Suddenly we had discovered this frequent, terrible, common experience of human beings, and we were supposed to do something about it. And none of us had a clue as to what to do, other than to encourage people to talk about what they had been through. But talking about what they'd been through tended to make most people worse rather than better. And so we were just fumbling along, trying to figure out, well, what do we do? And again, because I was in the mid-90s, I was a supervisor and instructor at Bessel van der Kolk's trauma clinic in Boston, just at the time that he began to use brain scan research to understand what was happening in the brains of traumatized people. And that changed everything, because what it showed us was that when people talked about the trauma, the language centers of the brain shut down, and instead all the centers of the brain where feelings and physical responses happen got overly active. And so we then, as a field, had to figure out, how do you treat emotions without words? How do you treat physical reactions without words? And one of the first approaches we began using was mindfulness, because it allowed us to help people study what got activated when they remembered what happened, when they were triggered by something either closely or distantly related to what happened. That became our first tool.
What kind of mindfulness did you use at that time?
Just teaching people, what I now call it everyday mindfulness. When I try to explain it to therapists, it's the practice of noticing your thoughts, feelings, and physical sensations as you are walking, talking, working, eating, doing whatever you do. It's really having a mindful relationship to moment experience, not just when you're sitting. And so that's what we brought into trauma treatment when we didn't know what else we should do. But the wonderful thing was that it was helpful. And so that's led over the years to a number of mindfulness-based treatments for trauma.
Wow. Well, you almost coach the client in mindfulness by asking questions, by pointing, directing attention.
Right, exactly. And by asking them to notice rather than feel. The classic therapist question, how do you feel? How did that make you feel? That classic question doesn't belong in a mindfulness-based approach. We have to teach people to notice, as you talk about that, what do you notice? What thoughts, what feelings, what physical reactions, which promotes a different relationship.
Nice.
So do you also think that trauma is ubiquitous?
I think it's hard to escape from life without exposure to some kind of trauma. I don't believe that all children are traumatized. I think there are actually families who are able to create a safe, secure environment for children. And I don't believe that simply being ignored or criticized is traumatic. Trauma involves fear, right? It involves some sense of, I'm going to be annihilated, whether or not that's factually accurate or not.
So in the example of being ignored, it might be that you feel you might be being ignored or neglected and then feel quite scared in response to that. And that would maybe differentiate, whether somebody experiences that as traumatic.
It also has to do with the degree of fear. And I'll give you my favorite example, which is actually an example from one of my daughters-in-law. As a child, her mother would leave the house and she never knew whether her mother was leaving for an hour, a day, or a week. And she was in charge of her younger brother. So she would have this terrible panic because if they ran out of food, she would have no way of getting food. If something happened to her little brother, she was the only person between him and disaster. So it was terrifying, as opposed to what I call middle class neglect, where children are often less important than the work schedule or the social life or the travel of the parents, where children feel hurt and they feel unimportant, but they don't feel terrified.
Mm-hmm. Right. So also a painful experience with consequences, but the distinction you're making from a traumatic experience is that experience of fear and terror.
Right. And or having a critical, judgmental parent versus having a critical, judgmental, and physically abusive parent.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So there's a level of fear. Being constantly criticized and rigidly controlled has painful emotional consequences, but it isn't traumatic. It's just hurtful.
So then how would adverse childhood experiences factor into that? So for some people, they will be traumatic, or are they always?
So adverse childhood experiences are often traumatic if you go through the list. The ACEs questionnaire, some are traumatic and some are circumstances that could be traumatic. Like, for instance, did you have an alcoholic or drug addicted family member? Right? So we know there's a very big association between drug abuse and physical violence toward children. It's not. Plenty of nonviolent alcoholic and drug-addicted parents, but still the child generally doesn't feel safe in the world of an drug-addicted parent. So the adverse childhood experiences leave children vulnerable. They can be traumatic. And the cumulative impact, imagine if you have 5 or 6 or 7 adverse childhood experiences. That's a lot of load on a developing brain and body.
Yeah, and for our listeners who may be less familiar with that phrase or that list, there's a list, and it includes things that you would expect, like abuse and neglect, and also includes things like parental divorce and parental incarceration and other things as well. So it's quite a range of things that are listed in that adverse childhood events list. And of course, there's other adverse events that aren't on the questionnaire, but it was just developed for research, and so that's, I think, the one you're referring to.
Yes. And listeners can Google it and, the ACE questionnaire, ACES, ACES questionnaire, and it'll come right up.
Yeah. So we are happy to have you on the show today, and you've got a new workbook out called Transforming the Living Legacy of Trauma, which is fabulous and very practical. So one place we thought might be useful is maybe just to kind of give us, and we've already sort of dove into it a little bit, but maybe you could give us just a sense of your thinking about the impact of trauma and some of the essential kind of biology or physiology that relates to it.
Right. And I coined this term living legacy because I wanted to convey that trauma, and one of the hallmarks of trauma, is that it doesn't leave you with a sense that something happened, it had a beginning, a middle, and an end, and you made it, you survived. The symptoms that persist after trauma keep reviving the sense of threat, danger, vulnerability, so that it never ends. And there is no felt sense that this is a legacy, right? And I happen to live in a house with many objects that are legacies of my parents and grandparents. And when I see them, that just reinforces, yes, that was then. The living legacy of trauma feels like it's happening now.
It reminds me of a quote. I forget who said it. The past isn't past. The past isn't over. It isn't even past.
Yeah, that's such a wonderful quote, and it's so perfect for trauma. And actually, the book is sort of related to my journey as a professional, because I started as a postdoctoral fellow in Judith Herman's clinic at Cambridge Hospital, where she was a big believer in educating clients about trauma and how it was still affecting them. And she came to that belief as a political feminist, intent on empowering clients by really revolutionizing the therapeutic relationship, in which typically, think of Freud, the typical therapeutic relationship is this very wise, silent therapist who says, and occasionally says something very wise and hard to understand. So her idea was, no, that just reinforces the sense of power disparity. So what we have to do instead is educate traumatized individuals about trauma, share with them everything we're learning, and make them full participants in the therapy. And in those days, the idea of educating a client was absolutely horrifying to all of the Freudian therapists, because that was too intellectual. But Judy Herman was insistent, so as postdoctoral fellows, we learned how to teach people about how trauma was affecting them. And that's what I set out to do in this workbook. Except, of course, it's now been updated to include what we know about the brain and the body, which we didn't know in the 90s. It was really fun for me because I could kind of touch back into my roots and appreciate how much we've learned figure out how do you make brain science user-friendly for people who might just have a high school education. So there were challenges that were important to me. And it's all based around an idea of using diagrams to explain complex ideas, which I owe to my clients, because back in the 90s, when Judy Herman said, go forth and educate your clients, what I found was that trauma was really inhibiting their capacity to understand concepts and process information. So I started drawing these diagrams, easel, so that my clients could see what I was talking about. And lo and behold, the diagrams seemed to really wake them up, get them curious, get them into this whole process of education.
They're very informative, the graphics that you use. And also your attitude of respect toward clients comes through very strongly.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad. Because that's so important. That's part of treating the client as a collaborator rather than as a patient.
I watched one YouTube video where you explain the client says no to you and you actually celebrate it. Like, thank you for setting a boundary. Good for you.
Right. Absolutely.
Knowing how hard that is, to come by, being able to say no and set a limit, especially if folks have had a history of trauma.
Exactly.
I'm thinking about your diagrams and I'm thinking we must talk about perhaps one of your favorites or one that's been particularly useful for your clients. I know there's some in your new book, but are there any that you feel like you come back to over and over again that seem the most useful or helpful for people?
I do. And actually, it's funny because I share my office with my son, who's also a psychologist, also a trauma therapist. And I have a large version of those diagrams in my office. And I noticed that what his favorite pages are, and I noticed what my favorite pages are. And they're slightly different.
Yeah.
I would say my favorite page, which actually I like better in the printed form than when I used to do it by hand, is the very first diagram in the book, which has an image for traumatic event, and then shows all the branches off it, show the living legacy of trauma. And I love to show that to people whom I'm meeting for the first time. And they look on it with such awe, such appreciation. They laugh and they say, well, right, I've had all of them at one time or another.
Yeah.
And it's so normalizing and really, I think, validating.
Profoundly so. Yeah.
Yeah. That's one of my very, very favorites. And what I particularly love to do with it is to ask the client, how did, and I'll use some of the most common symptoms. How did your depression help you to survive? How did your loss of interest or pleasure help you to survive? How did being irritable help you survive? And my clients love those questions, and they never seem to find it odd when I ask. So it kind of gets them, without my giving them a big lecture, I'm conveying that all of those symptoms represent adaptations to the abnormal circumstances they were placed in.
It also strikes me as a question that is so frequently not asked, but the moment you ask it, it makes total sense, right? As you're saying there, it's not a surprise at all when someone asks, because of course it serves some function.
Right. But it's funny, therapists often find those questions strange, but they never do.
Right.
It also seems to be one of the hallmarks of your approach. So those things that I think therapists typically turn into problems about the client. This is what's wrong with you. Your approach is, look how smart that was. That got you through that impossible situation repeatedly.
Right. Yes, look at what's right with you.
And then I think that probably enables the person to go toward peace internally and acceptance and appreciation of what's happening, as opposed to, here's something else wrong with me.
In addition to having been traumatized and humiliated, in addition to that, you're sick. This is not good news. This is not the message that people need.
So true. I know that one question that we were very curious about, because the word gets used quite a lot, and it seems like more and more, and just sort of general discourse, is this idea of triggers and triggering. So I just would love to hear how you think about that.
The language of triggers and triggering is a very good example of how kind of where we went when we were flailing around in the 90s trying to figure out how to help people. I don't know that it's the right word, because trigger is such a violent image. But on the other hand, it's very hard to come up with a better word, because if you say evoke, that's such a mild word. You know, if you hear a noise and you jump a million miles, that's a lot more than evoking.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. So I'm not even sure who came up with that language, but as we understand it better now, the brain and the body get sensitized to all the danger signals associated with any adverse or traumatic event. So that even if, even for people who have amnesia for what happened to them, their brains and bodies respond triggering stimuli. And often I say to people who say, well, I don't remember my childhood, I say, well, actually, on the contrary, you remember a lot. You remember feeling scared, remember feeling shame. So you actually remember a lot, because we always forget that we remember with our feelings and our bodies, not just with our minds.
Right. I'm thinking people think if I were remembering something, it would be a thought in my mind with words, or I would see it in my mind like a dream or something, like it would be vivid in some way. And what you're saying is we remember in our whole body, in our emotions.
Right. And particularly with trauma, there's a tendency for the brain to remember the feelings and reactions rather than the events.
So how is being triggered different from simply getting upset?
What I tell my clients is it's suddenness, intensity, and duration. So when we're triggered, we can all be reminded of very distressing, unpleasant things. But I can remember something unpleasant. I'm just thinking of a distressing event right now. And I don't suddenly go from feeling fine to feeling devastated, to go from calm to fearful, to go from calm to angry, or calm to rage, right? From feeling a little sadness to feeling completely overwhelmed by grief. It's the suddenness of a triggered feeling. The intensity is much worse, and it lasts. So that's suddenness, intensity, and duration. And I ask the client just to start by using those guidelines to differentiate a triggered feeling from a evoked feeling.
Is that the same as a flashback or no?
Well, I sometimes teach clients to use the term feeling flashback. I say you're having feeling flashback.
Okay.
And actually, that's a term that trauma survivors really respond to, because they know a flashback, but it helps them to get, okay, those sudden, intense, overwhelming feelings. That's a feeling flashback.
So almost the feelings are superimposed on the current reality.
Right. They're much louder. Yes.
Louder.
They're so loud, they're so big that current reality is obliterated.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll give you an example. I had a client whose college graduate daughter is home for a week or two, and who is quite angry at her mother because her mother was so incapacitated by the trauma that she couldn't be a mother to this child. And so this 22, 23-year-old is very angry at her mother and has made no effort to spend time with her mother while home from after college. Needless to say, any mother, if we asked everyone who's a parent in this audience, would you be hurt? I would be surprised if we didn't get 100% response. Yes, I would be very hurt if my child was ignoring me at any age. But in addition, the daughter's ignoring of the mother is triggering.
Mm-hmm.
So the mother has been alternately overwhelmed by hurt or anger at her daughter, and so, which obviously makes it very difficult to deal with a real situation, not uncommon in families with young adult children.
Mm-hmm. So again, it would be understandable that everybody would feel distress at being ignored by their child or anyone they love. But in this case, there's that intensity and that suddenness and that overwhelming quality of it that resonates with her experiences of trauma from her past. And
so it doesn't feel like hurt. It feels like a knife in the heart.
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So one question that comes up for me is no one ever to blame?
Well, yes, it's a problem. I mean, obviously, abusive parents are to blame. But if we're talking about our day-in, day-out relationships, triggering is not, here's what I say to clients. I say, you're not responsible for being triggered, but you are responsible for what you do when you get triggered, how you react. And so, to use the same mother as an example, when she turns on her daughter and from that triggered rage says, terrible things to her daughter, you're an ungrateful little, what, that's not handling being triggered in a healthy way that is going to, you can only imagine the daughter saying, well, I don't think I'm going to talk to my mother for another 3 months. So it's not getting her the results she wants. And it's also reinforcing all the hurt that's gone before it. So obviously, we're responsible for what we do and how we behave and what we say when we're triggered. But being triggered is no one's fault. And then that becomes, of course, tricky in relationships because when we're triggered by somebody, we have the tendency to say, you made me feel this way. But that is actually not blame that helps anybody. It's so much better for trauma survivors to understand they get triggered by others. Not that everybody in their lives is thoughtless, cruel, uncompassionate, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Some people seem dismissive of the whole idea of being triggered. So which probably is a disservice to those people who have to deal with trauma.
I find many trauma survivors feel dismissed when people say, oh, you were triggered. It's like nobody gets the depths to which this thoughtless comment sent me.
Oh.
Right? And so I understand that. I think it's a very, very important concept. It never works for loved ones to say, you're triggered. That's why you're mad at me. That never works. But I think it's also important, and I say this as a therapist in particular, very, very important to express empathy for people, because the experience of being triggered is not broken fingernail. It's very, very intense and painful.
Yeah, there's almost not enough empathy that like you couldn't overdo the empathy.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if I express as much empathy for a triggered feeling as I would to somebody who had really been terribly injured, for instance, if this college-age daughter had done or said something objectively cruel to her mother, right? That would be triggering and it would be wounding. And I think any of us would give her a lot of empathy. Too often people are misunderstood when they're triggered, right? They're told they're entitled, they're overreactive, because people are not getting, non-traumatized individuals don't have any way to understand what it feels like to be triggered, how intense it is.
And in your book, you have a section where you explain how can you tell you're triggered?
Yes.
Feeling terrified, panicky, hating oneself, hating others, rage, overwhelming shame, overwhelming emotion. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, because it's important for us to know, because otherwise, how do we gauge how to react? If we have any choice over our reaction, it helps to know, oh, I'm triggered. The knife is not really in my heart, feeling like somebody just stabbed me in the heart.
And what are positive triggers then?
So a positive trigger, I think that's a word I got from Deirdre, is that equally we can be positively stimulated. I mean, if you see somebody you like that you haven't seen in years, right? What gets triggered is lots and lots of positive experiences, right? So we feel warm and we feel joyous and we feel close to this person we may not have seen in years. A positive trigger of an old friendship elicits the feeling memories associated with that person.
Right. So when you think of that friend and those positive feelings arise, you're not necessarily having a narrative of a memory of a specific event or seeing in your mind's eye a specific memory. You just have a feeling of what it's like to be with them, and it all sort of comes up in your body. And
Absolutely. And also, work can be a positive trigger. I'm sure there isn't a human being on the planet who hasn't been through some loss or crisis or illness, and you think, how am I ever going to get it through the day? And then you go to work, and lo and behold, a switch turns in your brain, and you're able to do what you do. Children are positive triggers. It's what saves mothers and infants, right? On 2 hours of sleep and the baby's crying again, that's a positive trigger to get up and be a mother or a father.
Right.
So there are lots of positive triggers in our lives.
I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about how to work with triggers and triggering. As people are listening, they might be thinking, oh, goodness, I have triggers, or that sounds like me at times. So then the next step might be to just offer some breadcrumbs of places to start, the activities, got some great stuff in the book, but anything you want to share now. And connected to that, I also will mention that, you've been a pioneer and co-authored with Pat Ogden a book on sensorimotor psychotherapy, and really bringing a lot of attention to the body, which has been largely ignored in psychotherapy. So I want to thank you for that on behalf of the field of psychology and psychotherapy. And maybe that's connected here or not, but just kind of want to mention that.
Well, actually, it is. The first thing I teach people to do, obviously, when they recognize that they're triggered or even guess that they're triggered, I teach them to simply keep saying, it's really a mindfulness observation. I'm triggered. I'm noticing that I'm really, really triggered, right? Right. Really triggered.
Oh my, how I'm triggered.
Exactly. Because what that does is it keeps us in present time, right? I'm freaking out and I notice that I'm triggered, right? And how can I tell that I'm triggered? My heart is pounding, my chest feels tight, I feel sick to my stomach. All these thoughts are swirling in my head, right? Just keeping it there, because otherwise, what most of us do, just naturally, is we're triggered by something, and then we create a story about it. Right? I'm upset because that was unacceptable treatment. Right? And then we add to the story, right? Well, the story evokes more painful emotion, and then we add another chapter. And furthermore, right? And then so that's really a vicious circle when we attach the story to an intense feeling. So by teaching people just to say, I'm triggered, that's what's happening right now, right? I'm triggered. And then the next place I usually help people go is the body. So I might say, I actually had a client who emailed me today because she'd gotten triggered by having to make a decision in a flooring store between different flooring choices.
I can see that.
Yes, she gets right. She gets particularly triggered by choices because the wrong choice for her as a child always meant some kind of traumatic punishment. So I just quickly emailed her back, pause and breathe, right? Just pause and breathe. Let go of the need to make a decision right this minute, because so the next thing we can do after acknowledging this is what's happening, I'm triggered, is to breathe, to feel our feet on the ground. I usually teach people the order in which I teach these somatic resources, as they're called. I usually start with, can you feel your feet? Because that's the simplest. And when we're freaking out, we don't need something complicated. And then I say, if they say, yes, I can feel my feet, I say, okay, can you feel your spine? And most people say yes. And so I say, great, stay with your feet, stay with your spine, stay with your breath, stay with your core. Because in a way, the body holds the freaking out. We're freaking out, but our bodies are still there. Our feet are still working. The spine is still working. So really what I'm doing is asking the client to focus on what's here and now. My feet are always in the here and now. My spine is pretty much in the here and now. Right? And sometimes I have people notice both. So notice the anxiety, notice the fear, and then go back to your feet and back to your spine, right? And then the fear will come up again. Notice it. Go back to your feet, go back to your spine. Because that's a practice that over time gets easier and easier.
That's a very big deal. I know my personal experience, having been very disconnected from my body, if somebody had said somatic resources, that would have made no sense.
Right.
Now, your book contains a beautiful, extensive list of somatic resources for centering, for containment, movement resources for calming, energizing. And people who perhaps are like the way I used to be may not realize what a huge thing this is, that they're missing out on this in talk therapy.
Right. Right. Absolutely. But I find, and tell me if this is true in your experience, that most people who are disconnected from their bodies can still feel their feet.
Yes. Right.
Right. And so to me, that's like, Well, thank goodness, because you wouldn't get very far. That's kind of essential for getting through the day.
True.
And so that's where we start. What's hard when you're disconnected from your body is to be able to notice the subtlety of body sensation. But usually, if you move your arm, you can feel your arm moving, even when you're pretty disconnected. Would you agree? You're my expert now.
Right. In the 3-phase trauma treatment model that you discuss in detail, that phase 1 has to do with building all these resources. So all of a sudden you have an arsenal of tools that you can use to cope with life.
And you have a foundation. The point of that first phase of trauma treatment is to build a foundation, because it's so hard when you're alternately freaking out and then going numb, right? And somebody says, what do you want for lunch? And you haven't a clue because you can't feel anything, right? Or you can't, or making a decision is triggering. So building the foundation is crucial. And I think this is just my opinion. If you talk to Pat Ogden, the founder of Sensorimotor Psychotherapy, she would probably say, build your foundation on the body. I would say build your foundation wherever you can find a place to build it, right? If you're an intellectual and you're disconnected from your body, start with your mind, right? Because I kind of hate to say there's one right way, because then what about all the people who can't do it that one right way?
Right. Accessing the body could be very triggering and challenging for some people as a starting place. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was wondering, what do you mean by the body's intelligence?
I think the body and the mind are wiser than we often realize. I think about phrases like trust your gut. That's basically a phrase that means trust your body.
Mm-hmm.
And I love to give people, people who are trying to make a difficult decision or even a small decision that's hard. I often say, well, imagine if you decided this. What happened? How does your body react if you imagine choosing this direction? I remember working with someone who was trying to decide between staying where she was, which was a city she loved and felt comfortable in, or whether to move home closer to her elderly parents, and going back and forth and back and forth. But when she imagined making either decision and her body responded, she then had a much clearer sense. Okay, this is what I need to do.
So she could feel a felt sense of that situation.
Right. Rather than the intellectual pros and cons, she had the felt sense. So she imagined being back in, I forget, Minnesota, perhaps with her family of origin. And she began to feel very warm and very comfortable. And then she imagined living in San Francisco, where she was living at the time, and feeling excited and stimulated. And then she could compare those two felt experiences instead of continuing to list all the intellectual reasons in favor.
Yeah, because it's almost the brain's job to just keep coming up with pros and cons. I mean, it could do that until the end of time. Right. As an intellectual exercise, we're really good at that. Yeah. But you need to plug into the body to figure out what feels like the right side to land on and this kind of thing.
Right. Absolutely. And sometimes the body's intelligence is old intelligence. It's how the body adapted to stressful, adverse, or traumatic experiences. So if we appreciate, okay, so the reason, I'll just use the example, the reason I'm disconnected from my body was that it helped me survive. Wow, what a smart body. because most of these choices about who we become are made long before we have a brain capable of being able to choose. If you think of sort of the classic situation in childhood trauma, is a child looking for love from parents who are abusive. Now, we know from 40 years of attachment research that the attachment drive in children propels them to seek closeness to the parent when they're lonely, tired, scared, or faced with a new situation. So the child who's being abused by a parent has these two conflicting drives. One is to seek protection from the parent, but when it's abusive parent, there's an equally strong drive to flee or to fight the parent. Mm-hmm. And so what you see in children as young as age 1, you see them approaching the parent and then backing away, approaching the parent and then freezing and looking really kind of scared. And you see it in adulthood when there is this strong attachment-seeking drive coupled with a sensitivity to getting triggered in the relationship and pushing the other person away.
Now, is shame a big part of this ball of yarn?
Yes. Well said. Yeah, right. It certainly is. And I have a theory about shame. There's so much written and spoken about shame. But what I believe is that shame is part of the survival defense of submission. So when we feel shame, we feel humiliated, we hate ourselves, we think it's our fault, and all of that makes it easier to submit because we feel wrong instead of wronged. Right? So the shame starts out as a survival defense and then ends up being this albatross of a living legacy that people carry for years afterward.
Your approach is very much about evoking interest and engaging the client and mutual exploration and fun. Mm-hmm. It's very, very sort of lighthearted.
Right. I believed actually that the darker the experience, the more important it is to be lighthearted.
Wow.
In our healing process. I don't believe it helps anyone for the therapy to be as heavy as the original experience.
When you put it that way. Right.
Wow.
Yeah, right.
That's just my opinion.
Yeah.
You're right about the importance of bearing witness to one's own experience. Why is that so?
The theory has always been that trauma tends to occur in secret. To be able to disclose what has happened in secret to a safe witness was always believed to be the cornerstone of trauma treatment. But what many people have noticed in the field, as we've learned more about trauma, is that most people are so overwhelmed by telling the story that if they fail to register that they're being witnessed. Mm-hmm. Because if you're telling the story blow by blow of what's happened to you, right, it's so emotionally overwhelming that what's real is the story, not I'm sitting in a room with somebody who is safe and kind, and I'm telling this person what I experienced in the past.
Absolutely.
So this idea that it's more important to tell the story to ourselves, to me, doesn't involve the blow-by-blow details. What's important is being able to say, because I was scared every day of my life, I get triggered into fear easily.
Wow.
Right? Because I was treated unkindly, I don't trust people to be kind. That's telling the story to yourself.
Oh, beautiful.
This has been great, Janina. Thank you so much for your time and all of your work in this area, which is so important. To say goodbye, any way that our listeners could learn more about you, connect with you? Yeah.
Sure. They can go to my website, which is janinafisher.com. There are a number of papers and articles they can download for free, as well as links to my book if they're interested. But I love my website being able to be a resource to people who are interested in trauma.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much.
It's been great. Thank you.
Guys, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening today.
If you enjoyed this episode, we hope you'll hit subscribe, leave us a great rating or review, and spread the word. You can also go to noblemindpodcast.com to join our email list. You'll get a weekly behind-the-scenes message, news, announcements, and other special goodies we come up with just for you. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.